Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Rotten Hobby Podcast, where we tell the truth about diabetes. The truth is sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good, but if we're honest, it's rarely good. I don't think anybody would ever describe it as good. Sometimes it's manageable. Let's go with manageable. Sometimes it's manageable. Sometimes it doesn't feel very manageable. But if you're like me, you have questions. I have a lot of questions, actually, still. Even after 2 decades of dealing with this condition, I have questions, and some of them pretty basic about why it is that my body works the way it does or doesn't work the way that it does. And my guess is a lot of you out there have that too. Thankfully, I have a unique opportunity in my life because I have somebody who actually lives in my house and sleeps next to me at night who is an expert in this area. And of course, I speak of my wife, Dane Scott. So Dane, thanks for walking across the street with me and joining us in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
I know I didn't give you a lot of choice, but you're being a good sport.
I think I always have a choice.
Yeah.
So
20 years of marriage, I'm aware you get a choice. All right. Well, for all of our lovely folks at home who may or may not be wondering who you are, can you give us a breakdown of the alphabet soup after your name that we spent a whole lot of time and money on you getting, and help the folks understand why it is they ought to listen to you?
All right. Well, I'm a family nurse practitioner, and for those who may or may not know, a nurse practitioner is a nurse, an RN, who then has to have at minimum a master's degree beyond the RN and a national certification to get that license. And that allows me to diagnose and treat patients as a healthcare provider. Then beyond that, I've been working in endocrinology for almost a decade now, believe it or not. Yeah,
I do remember.
And of course, endocrinology is the specialty of medicine that deals basically with glands. You know, you have thyroid problems and diabetes and things like that. A lot of times endocrinology is what we're into. And then
So you're into glands.
A couple very specific glands. I don't do all the glands, just a couple of the glands. But
This is the exciting conversation that happens in our house.
Oh, yeah. And then I apparently really love taking tests, is what we've learned. So
I'm aware.
So I'm certified as a Certified Diabetes Care and Education Specialist, CDCES. A lot of listeners may be more familiar with the CDE, or Certified Diabetes Educator, which is what that used to be called. Mm-hmm. They changed it a couple of years ago because they realized that didn't really explain the breadth and depth of what we do in that specialty. So they wanted to make it a little more descriptive.
Yeah, the previous one was delightfully vague.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's a conversation for another time.
Sure.
But, and then I also have the BC80M, which is Board Certified Advanced Diabetes Manager, which is similar to the first one, but it's designed for people who can write prescriptions, basically. So it includes a little more of the pharmacology and testing and monitoring that I actually have to do on a daily basis.
Right. Absolutely. So you've been doing this professionally for 10 years.
Close to, yeah.
Thousands of patients you've seen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you're actually on one of the, you actually get to help write one of the tests for one of those groups, right?
I get to help critique and approve the questions. Board certification tests actually go through this whole process that involve, there are people who write test questions as their job.
Wow.
Big organizations you remember in school seeing Scantron?
Yeah. Oh yeah, man.
Yeah,
Love the Scantron. Number 2 pencil.
Yeah. Scantron is actually a company that does this. And then, so they bring us the questions, and then we as the expert panel have to go through them and say, well, this is too vague, or this is misleading, or I would be confused by this, and I already have this certification for several years. And so we kind of come in at a midpoint.
Okay. So it's a huge, long process, part of which is you.
Yes.
Well, the team you're on.
I have a lot more sympathy and respect for test writers now that I'm on the other side of it. So
I remember some choice words about some of these tests back when you were on the other end of the filling out the bubble sheets on the tests.
Yes. And we all on the board, just in case anybody listening happens to be at least on the board I'm on, we all try to take that into account and be respectful of our memories of being on the other side of that computer screen. So
really, I just kind of people. Anytime I took any of those tests growing up or in high school, I just figured there was somebody on the other side, like laughing gleefully at all the pain they were inflicting upon us. Like, oh, I'll get them. This one will trip them up. So it's not like that.
No, in fact, if we were too convinced that the wording of a question would trip somebody up who had the requisite knowledge, we would actually throw out the question and replace it. So.
All right. Well, that's good to know. Good to know. All right. Well, as much as it is fun to talk about the ins and outs of test prep that most people will never see in their entire lives, we had multiple conversations about what we could talk about, and obviously you will feature on this a bunch. But I was thinking and reflecting after 20 years of this, like, when you first get diagnosed, right? When you first get diagnosed, you want to like learn about what's going on. And of course, we live in a time now. 20 years ago, it was a little harder. I don't think WebMD was the thing yet. You should see the face you just made at WebMD. All healthcare providers love themselves some WebMD.
These days we prefer WebMD to Dr. Google.
Dr. Well, Dr. Google will give you back WebMD if you know how to Google correctly. That's the thing. And actually, I'm guessing if I'd looked it up on WebMD anyway, it just would have told me I had cancer, because that's apparently what everybody. If you go WebMD, everybody
it does tend to tell. Yeah,
everybody says you have cancer.
Oh, speaking of WebMD, we should probably preface the rest of this conversation with a little standard disclaimer that this does not replace medical advice.
Right.
This is just general information. We are not your healthcare provider. Take this information back to your healthcare provider and talk to them about it.
I surely am not your healthcare provider. I am nobody's healthcare provider.
And I am not intending to be the healthcare provider of someone who's listening.
No, but if somebody wants to take this podcast back to their healthcare provider and recommend it, that's great. You should definitely do that.
Go for it. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so I was thinking back on this, and I was realizing somewhere in all of this, in 20 years, and all the different medications I've taken, all the different kinds of treatment options I've had, and I've been on things you swallow and things you inject, and all kinds of stuff, just trying to manage this fun. Somewhere in all of that, you kind of lose track of what it is that this whole thing is about in the first place. So you start me out with just something basic here. Why does my body hate sugar? Because it's really, really tasty. Like, of all the things, and why does it have to be that? Why couldn't it be something like my body really hates like broccoli, and I could just have some kind of like, I just can never eat broccoli. My body won't let me. I have broccolitis. But why isn't that a thing? But maybe that's not so important. But what is it about me? So I'm type 2. Let's just preface it that way. So let's start with the type 2s, multiple types. But let's start with the type 2s, which is the most prevalent, I think, right now.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be a lot of it, and I think post the pandemic.
Roughly 10 to 1.
Yeah, and I think post the pandemic, everybody's going to have it. But what is it about it? Like, why does my body not like that tasty sugar? What's wrong with me, Dane? Why am I broken?
You want me to? Where do you want? No, I'm kidding.
No, as far as my blood sugar goes, I don't know. We can talk about our marriage later.
So, not to sound Freudian, but you can a little bit blame your parents on this one.
Oh, goody.
Yeah. So diabetes is classified by cause.
Okay.
So the difference between type 1 and type 2 is the cause underlying the diabetes. You can't classify it by treatment. So if you take insulin, that doesn't automatically mean you have type 1. Most people with diabetes over a long enough timeline will need insulin.
Right. I remember my insulin phase.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily the classification. Type 2's defining characteristic is a whole body-wide resistance to insulin. So, and then there's a lot of other things that chain off of that. The rabbit hole can go pretty deep on this.
My body is resistant to insulin.
Yes.
And that's not a good thing, because I'm thinking about like stain-resistant clothing, which is the only clothing I buy, because it's a good thing. But this is not a good thing. So
one way to think about it, a really commonly used metaphor that a lot of your listeners may have heard is, so when you eat, you take in nutrition, part of which is carbohydrates, which is one of the 3 molecules types that we can use for energy in the human body.
The best tasting kind.
Well, fat's one of the other ones, and protein's the third. So they're all pretty tasty. Yeah. So
that's why barbecue is good, because it's a mix of fat, protein, and sweet, tasty barbecue sauce.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. But those are the 3 macronutrients.
Okay.
And so beginning of the process, glucose, which is all carbohydrates, eventually make it into the bloodstream as glucose, which is a very simple form of carbohydrate or sugar that then theoretically your cells, so your organs, your heart, your brain, your muscles, all of you can use for energy to do whatever work they need to do at that moment,
right?
Which is absolutely necessary.
So it's the fuel we run on.
It's the fuel we run on. And there are actually parts of your body that can only run on glucose, one of which is your brain. So
right, I heard once like how many Skittles a day worth of sugar your brain uses, and it was tremendous.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
So and even people who are on very, very low carbohydrate diets, like the keto diet, what keto refers to actually is a process that happens in your body chemistry that converts the other macronutrients back. It makes sugar, mostly in the liver, so that there's glucose present for your brain to run on.
Oh, got to keep that brain moving.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, all of that happens. So if you think of the sugar needs to get from the blood into the cells. So it needs to get from the highway to the office. Okay?
Right.
The door is locked. Right?
Oh.
Insulin's the key. Insulin's the key card if we want to be in a modern office, whatever. Insulin is how that sugar makes that transition to where it needs to be. But when you have type 2 diabetes, it's a little bit like you've got a really, stubborn lock that doesn't quite work. So you have to sit there and try 15 times instead of once to actually get the door open.
So you're saying I got the key card from the hotel desk that doesn't work?
Yes.
And I'm sitting there and it just keeps flashing red at me?
Yeah.
Instead of flashing green?
Yeah.
God, that's so frustrating.
And you have to go back to the office and get 3 key cards before it'll work.
Yeah.
So if you get more and more and more insulin in the system, it will eventually overcome the resistance and work. Which is what usually happens. So one of the hallmark differences between a type 1 type 1s have an autoimmune problem where they don't make insulin in the first place. They use it fine. They just don't make it.
Oh, okay.
So one of the big differences is especially early in the diabetes or pre-diabetes, sometimes type 2 patients will, if you tested their insulin levels, their bodies are actually making high normal, even above normal levels of insulin. But then it's just not being used very well.
Gotcha. And does that insulin come from one of those glands you're so fond of?
It comes.
I knew glands were coming in here somewhere.
It comes from the pancreas.
Oh, our good friend the pancreas.
The pancreas is a very busy gland. Its most well-known function is to make insulin, but it's actually got a lot of jobs.
Oh. Multitasker.
If you want to go on a funky little rabbit hole, it is the only gland that is both exocrine and endocrine.
Wow.
Yes.
If I knew what that meant, I'd be really excited.
Yeah.
Okay.
It goes. Yeah. Well, here's one that'll bake your noodle. Is exocrine is things that go outside the body.
Yeah. Exo. Got it. Like
Yeah.
exoskeletons.
Yeah. So the pancreas creates digestive enzymes that go into your intestines, and technically, the inside of your intestines where the food is considered outside the body.
Right. It's like the center of the donut.
Exactly.
It's outside, even though it's inside.
Yes.
Yes, that's weird, and it makes me uncomfortable to think about that.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad we could share that discomfort with everyone.
There you go. All right, so my problem is that I've got plenty of sugar running around in there, and I've got probably plenty at this point of insulin running around there. But my cells are like, you know what, insulin? I don't like the look of you. We're not letting you in right now.
Something like
that. We're
that.
gonna make it hard. You got to really bang on that door.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So and of course, that means what? It means
So if I will apologize in advance to all the listeners for the I tend to talk in metaphors a lot because I'm a visual thinker.
That's right.
So let's picture a high school. Okay.
Everybody's favorite time of year or favorite time of life, high school.
Well, yes. So, and let's think of those like little glucose sugar molecules as the kids in the high school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what they should be doing is going neatly and nicely to their classrooms and doing work in their classrooms. Those are your cells. That's where they're supposed to be. That's where all the work gets done.
Gotcha.
Okay. What's actually happening is they're staying in the hallway, which is your bloodstream, and breaking stuff.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like less Saved by the Bell, more like Lord of the Flies.
Yes. Yeah. Because when there's too much sugar in the bloodstream for too long, it causes inflammation, it causes damage, and it causes damage to both the circulatory system, the blood,
yeah,
and the nervous system. are also damaged by being constantly exposed to too much glucose. It actually, after a while, at high enough levels, it's toxic. And I want to be very clear. I'm not saying glucose in general is toxic.
No.
Glucose
You need it.
at high, exactly. Sorry, guys, but anything at a high enough dose is toxic.
Sure.
Oxygen, water, these things, you need a certain amount. You exceed that amount, it starts to be a problem.
Right.
Same thing with glucose.
Right.
And in this case, it's not even that there's too much in the body, it's that it's in the wrong place.
Right. It's hanging out in the hallway.
It's hanging out in the hallway.
It's bored in the hallway. And bored teenagers in the hallway versus, teenagers actively doing what they're supposed to be doing in the classrooms.
Yes.
Yes, we want to avoid bored teenagers in the hallway.
It's the beginning of Dangerous Minds, not the end.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
okay.
So this is why, especially the negative consequences of diabetes, they happen over time, right? Like I hear about, you'll lose feeling in your feet and you'll go blind and, all that kind of stuff. And it's, it's not going to happen tomorrow. Like if you're diagnosed. And so if you're like me,
okay,
we talked about this in my last episode. When you're like me and you get diagnosed at like A1C of 13, fasting blood sugar over 300, they're like, oh Lord.
Yep.
Bad.
Yep.
And it's not that it's going to, and they're right. I mean, they're right. That's bad. It's not bad as in this is going to hurt you tomorrow, but it's bad in that, you can't let this go for too long because it's going to add up. It's like a cumulative effect.
Yes. So there are, so in the healthcare world, we talk about acute versus chronic. Right. So
yes.
Chronic are long-term things. Acute is right now things.
Chronic, but not like in the Puff Daddy sense of chronic.
Yes. Okay. Different type of chronic.
Different kind of chronic.
Much less fun.
Yeah. Or the Colorado sense of chronic. Since
we do. Yeah. So, a very, very high blood sugar, even in a type 2 and a type 1, there's this other thing that can happen. That's, but you can develop a right now problem from high blood sugar, but in someone who's otherwise relatively healthy, has type 2, it's relatively uncommon. Okay. But what we mostly worry about with type 2 diabetes, you're right, is the long-term consequences, which can take years. Now, the problem is, again, going back to this underlying genetic thing, right? Because the reason a lot of people have this insulin resistance is genetic.
Okay.
Yes, lifestyle factors into it, but there's a strong genetic component to it as well. People seem to develop those complications at different rates, so it can be really hard to predict when or if or which ones people are going to get. But what we do know is there was this big study done in the 90s called the diabetes.
All the great stuff came out in the 90s.
Yeah, it was the DCCT, Care and Complications Trial. If I'm misnaming that and somebody out there calls me on it, I'm sorry. I always refer to it by the abbreviation. But that's really was a landmark where they really were able to point at the rates of complications and compare them up against that dreaded number. All of you probably know, the A1C.
Oh, we're going to have to do an episode on that. We won't. Yeah. We don't need to talk about it now. We're going to get there.
Right. But that's where they were able to say, there are these cutoff points where we see a real uptick in that study. It varies a little between studies, but that study, what they came out with is a full point percentage-wise on the A1C correlates to approximately, it's a curve, not a line, but approximately a 40% reduction in risk.
Oh, wow.
Of complications.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
So
help me understand, so insulin resistance, my whole body, like everything, like every cell. Okay.
Yep.
So that does feel like, I know we don't, do we know why? You said somewhat
it's
genetic.
Okay. Yeah, there's a strong genetic component, and it's actually, they're starting to get into, sub-branches of genetics where they study genes being switched on and off, both within your own lifetime and generationally. So they think there's a big component there.
Okay. Does it tend to run in families?
Yes.
Okay.
Although if you're the unfortunate one that's the first one in the family, sorry.
Yeah.
But it does, and actually a lot of times if someone's the first person in their family to get it, and they get it at a young age, we'll go looking to make sure we've diagnosed it correctly.
Gotcha. So do you think, is there a reason, do we know why? It just feels like it's also like, if you look at the overall rates, the overall rates of diagnosis has definitely gone up. Is that because more people are actually have the genetic trait, or is it just that more people are actually just showing up with it? yeah, like what's going on?
It's a combination. Diagnosis has improved. Awareness of the need to have screening and diagnosis earlier has improved.
So part of it is we're just looking for it more.
Which is cutting down on the rates of complications, relatively speaking, too. Yeah. Just because, people aren't waiting until something's weird before they go in and get checked out. Some of it going back to that generational thing, if now some of it is, prior to the mid 20th century, we didn't even really acknowledge type 2 as a thing. They didn't really know about it.
Oh, okay.
But if you look back at, say, our great grandparents, or anyone pre 20th century, the amount of physical labor involved in just living your daily life.
Okay.
Like we've got some clothes in the washer right now, right? Like that task, 100 years ago would have been an all-day thing that would have given me my upper body workout for the week.
Right. Would have got down by the river.
Yeah.
Right.
Or the wash tub or whatever.
Yeah,
but still. And so if you factor in, and so there's a theory that, these metabolic syndrome issues that we're seeing now, which is, diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, we can partially attribute to lifestyle because we're all a lot more sedentary and we have a lot more ready access to high-calorie food than our ancestors did. There's also a theory that, again, some genes seem to have on and off switches, and it seems a little bit more likely if your parent or grandparent had those metabolic syndrome genes get switched on in them, their descendants kind of start off either more likely or with the genes already switched on. They're trying to figure that out, but there does seem to be people have noticed a trend where it seems like there's no diabetes in a family and then there's one family member and everybody after them, the dominoes start falling. So some of it's environmental, some of it's genetic, some of it's just that people are living longer.
Well, that's true too. I was thinking about that like 100 years ago. I mean, did you live? I mean, if you didn't know any better, and I mean, I wouldn't honestly. I think it was on time. Like I really wouldn't know something was up unless. I mean, the only reason I know something's up is because I, stick my finger and put it in the machine and it tells me, gives me my score for the day. We'll talk about that sometime too. Or whatever. Like otherwise, if I'm really, really high, like I may feel like tired. And obviously if I'm really, really low, you feel that too. But that would be less rare. But yeah. So it sounds like before lifestyle was kind of check on it because like it was there, but it just nobody had enough sugar running around in their body for it to become
and
big.
the thing, even in the modern era, right? The cutoff for diagnosing type 2 diabetes or diabetes in general, but on an A1C is 6.5%.
Yeah.
Right. Which is high enough to be abnormal, but most people don't have a lot of symptoms at that point.
Yeah.
They might feel a little under the weather, but especially if the blood sugar's been sort of gradually creeping up over months or years, they might feel a little more tired, but they might just attribute it to, hey, I'm 40 now or whatever. Right. And you have to think about, can I go into a little bit of gross history here?
Sure. Why not?
Okay.
If I tell you no, I'm just going to, we'll get calls or something. Like, why didn't you? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the term diabetes actually refers to two completely different disorders. There's diabetes mellitus, which is what we're talking about here.
Right. Type
1, type 2, gestational, that all falls under diabetes mellitus. Some people pronounce it mellitus. Just if you're a Latin scholar, don't call me. There's also diabetes insipidus, which is a disorder of some brain hormones that's completely unrelated. It has nothing to do with blood sugar. The reason they share that name is because diabetes comes from, I believe it's the Latin, forgive me if it's the Greek, but I'm pretty sure it's the Latin.
Sounds Latin.
Siphon. It was in reference to the main symptom that doctors could identify back when these names were come up with, which was frequent urination.
Oh, okay.
You have to pee a lot.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, if you think about it, most people with type 2 haven't developed that symptom by the time they have it.
Right.
Or it's subtle, right? Now, this is where we get to the gross history part. The second part of the name, Insipidus versus Mellitus, comes from the names for bitter, Insipidus.
Oh, man, I can see where this is going.
Sweet, Mellitus. Guess how 17th and 18th century doctors had to diagnose the difference?
Man, you think you have it rough now.
I'm so glad I'm not a healthcare provider. For those of you who aren't keeping up with my poor husband who's been subjected, they had to taste their patient's urine. Sorry.
Oh, man. Before or after they put the leeches on them?
Probably during.
Okay.
While you're waiting for the leeches, you can go.
It was a gross time.
It was a gross time. So I'm really glad I don't put. But going back to that, so really, when they diagnosed diabetes mellitus back then, it was pretty much always type 1. It was very symptomatic, very abrupt onset, very and there was not much they could do about it.
So, okay. So for us type 2s, I mean, I think the takeaway there is, something is up, because since it's so widespread, it seems obvious that it's somehow genetic or something like that. I mean, there's something up that the insulin resistance is there. It's just not working. Your cells aren't taking in the way that you need it to. And then whether or not that manifests, when and where and how that manifests is, maybe there's a little bit of lifestyle stuff in there, like you talked about. But whether it was going to happen or not was really up in the air.
And a lot of
that was a done deal. Like,
and
at
some of
point,
it is our ancestors were, in a way, if you think about it, probably sort of self-treating, because the first line of defense is, eat well, which means less processed food.
We didn't have processed food.
Right. Smaller portions.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have much to begin with. And get as much physical activity as possible, all of which improves, if exercise improves your ability to use your own insulin and take up sugar for hours afterwards. So if you're doing activity all day long, every day, even if you had the genetics to have type 2, you were sort of controlling it on your own back then.
So it also helps understand why things like, just natural human development and, evolution doesn't get rid of this thing, because it wasn't really a problem
It wasn't a threat.
It was yet another one of those things that only became a thing in our modern convenience, everything at your fingertip, DoorDash world, which is why, I mean, you figure the last couple of years we've been through with COVID and the lockdowns and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, it's no wonder I think we already are, and we'll probably continue to see an uptick in diagnosis. Because even those who even manage to have some healthy exercise habits, like all that stuff goes out of the window, and, comfort eating is real and it feels good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So what about the type 1s? So you said the cause.
Yeah. So type 1, which years ago was known as juvenile onset, because that's when it's most common, but they stopped calling it that because it can show up at any time.
Type 1 can?
Yeah. It can show up at any time, just like type 2 can. It's just less common in adults. Usually adults have already had it for a long time.
And similarly, follow up with that, similarly, like type 2 can show up in kids. It's just less common. It tends to show up mostly in adults.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Although the rule of thumb is still, if you have diabetes show up in a kid, it's type 1 until proven otherwise.
Oh, okay.
So that's why kids always go to a expert, just to be safe.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so type 1 is actually an autoimmune problem.
Oh.
So the body, and just because it gets used as a catchphrase or a commonly used. So autoimmune refers to any medical problem where your own immune system has mistakenly identified something in your system that's supposed to be there as a threat and has decided to attack it.
What would be was there another example you might be familiar with of an autoimmune problem?
Gosh, there's a ton of them. Some allergies are autoimmune. You're basically allergic to part of yourself in a way. That's oversimplifying. But
it works for us.
There are forms of thyroid disease that are autoimmune. There are, lupus is an autoimmune issue, totally separate from diabetes. But, there are skin conditions that are autoimmune. There's autoimmune problems can affect any system in the body.
Gotcha.
Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune thing. Anyway, so they, what happens with type 1 diabetes folks is the cells in the pancreas that actually manufacture and make insulin become the target of immune attack.
Oh.
And this doesn't usually happen all at once. Autoimmunes tend to kind of flare and then go away for a little while, and then flare and go away.
Okay.
Right? So over several years, they're losing their ability to make insulin. But for the first couple times this happens, there's probably no change in blood chemistry. There's no change in symptoms. There's no outward sign this is happening at all. Until they cross the threshold where they can't make enough to keep up, and their blood sugar usually, not always, but usually just skyrockets.
Gotcha.
And so they end up very symptomatic, usually end up in the hospital, and that's how they're usually diagnosed. Not always, especially the adults.
Gotcha.
But the main difference for that lay people are going to see between someone with type 1 and someone with type 2 is someone with type 2 is much more likely to have other, like the trifecta, the high cholesterol, the high blood pressure, the whole metabolic syndrome.
Right.
They are able to be treated with a variety of medications that includes insulin. So
Gotcha.
they may be on insulin. They may even, I've seen type 2 patients who are on insulin pumps.
Okay.
But they have a wide variety of options as far as treatment goes, because most of them, their body makes at least some insulin.
Right.
And that can vary. They can wane over the years, but
Sure.
And then the doses. Typically type 2s, since they are insulin resistant, are going to take, if they do take artificial insulin, it's going to be a lot larger doses.
Okay.
Usually.
Yeah.
Someone with type 1, really the only option for treatment for them is insulin. Right. They are going to get treated with insulin pretty much exclusively.
Okay.
There are some exceptions to that, but again, I don't want to get into the weeds. But someone who has type 1 diabetes really, for most of that period of their lives, once they're diagnosed, if their choice is take insulin or die.
Ooh. Yeah.
They have what's referred to as absolute insulin deficiency, which is they don't make it, they can't make it, and the glucose will build up to a dangerous and potentially fatal point if they're not getting that injected insulin.
So with the type 1s, it's different, same kind of thing, different problems. So type 1's problems are just physically isn't enough insulin periods. The cells are fine with it. The key cards work. There just aren't enough keys for everybody.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Type 2, there's insulin running around. It's just that
there's millions of keys, just half of them are broken.
Yeah, half of them. Okay, yeah. The doors are broken. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense, and it also explains why. Again, I think I know I struggled with it when I was asked to go. One of my treatment plans for a while there was involving insulin, and you're just like, well, wait a minute, hold on, that doesn't seem right. But now you've explained it, that makes sense. All right, and can you give us the 60-second, you don't have to, whatever, on gestational, which I think is probably the other one people have at least somewhat heard of, is gestational diabetes. Sure. It's obviously something that the ladies of the audience might be interested in. Their significant others who maybe want to support them too. So is that more like one or the other?
It's more like two.
Okay.
So women with gestational diabetes, gestational diabetes is specifically diabetes that shows up during pregnancy.
Right.
And there are actually cutoff points where if it shows up too early in the pregnancy, we actually consider it type 2 that was just undiagnosed prior.
Oh.
So because the hormones involved in pregnancy increase insulin resistance in every woman.
Okay.
So depending on where your body's threshold is for that to begin with, sometimes it crosses the line where your body just can't keep up anymore.
Gotcha.
So what gestational diabetes is diabetes that specifically shows up during pregnancy. And then in most, not all, many cases, will return to being able to have normal blood sugar levels without medication after the baby's born.
Okay.
However, a woman who has had gestational diabetes for the next decade after that pregnancy has a 50-50 chance of developing type 2.
Oh.
So if you have a history of gestational and you went back to normal, I'm sorry, you're not out of the woods. Make sure that your healthcare provider is getting that screening test at least once a year and watching you, because often what gestational is just you are on the threshold of developing type 2 eventually, and you just haven't gotten there yet without that extra strain on your system.
Gotcha.
But yeah, and gestational is because we don't like to test drugs in pregnant women, go figure. The options are pretty limited. So most gestational diabetes, there's a couple of pills we'll use, but most people with gestational diabetes are treated either with really strict diets, or often we just jump straight to insulin with those ladies because we know it's safe for the baby.
Yeah. Well, and it's short time, right? And then once the baby's born, then you have more options because you got more treatments that have been tested.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the most important question is, for me as a type 2 and having lived with it, what I think I hear you saying that I would like some confirmation on is, this is not my fault and I did not break myself.
No. I fully agree with that statement. So now I want to be careful how I phrase this. So
sure.
Because yes, as we were talking about before, lifestyle has a big impact.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? eating healthy. First of all, I don't care whether you have diabetes or not. We should all eat our vegetables. We should all get our exercise. I mean, that's going to keep you healthier no matter what.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Yeah.
But there are people who have, as close to perfect as a human being can have in terms of lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
They do everything they should, and they still develop diabetes.
Right.
There are people who honestly pay zero attention to their lifestyle, zero attention to their weight, zero attention to their exercise or eating habits, and just because sometimes, things feel a little unfair, they never develop any health problems other than,
right,
whatever struggles they have with their own appearance or what have you. So that genetic component was lying in wait.
Right. Okay.
So, yes.
So it doesn't, so I'm still responsible. Like I'm responsible for me. I got to deal with I got to play the hand I've been dealt.
Right.
But
and
I was, there was a two of spades in there, and
yeah. And
you got to figure out how to deal with it.
And, having a healthy lifestyle, avoiding sugar-containing beverages, eating healthy, a healthy diet. By the way, a healthy diet for someone with diabetes is a healthy diet, full stop. You don't need to invest in special food.
There's not going to be a Rotten Hobby spin-off prepared food line of approved diabetes food.
I did just suggest less processed food.
Oh, you're right.
Have to be careful about that.
We'll have to find a new way to monetize this whole thing.
Hey, just stick with the t-shirts, man.
There you go.
We never told people why it's called what it is.
No, I'm holding on to that.
Oh, okay.
I've decided. And it's not a very good story. So people will be really disappointed when they find out, but I'm
I was to say, but okay.
I'm leaving it alone for now.
You're in charge.
All
so, of this.
Nice.
So, and then of course getting that routine physical activity, which if you have a job where you're on your feet all day, good for you. You have my sympathy. That doesn't count. Exercise separate from what you have to do to get through your daily life that builds muscle, uses your heart, gets you breathing heavy. That's what we mean. Those things will all, if you don't have diabetes yet, or if it runs in your family, it may hold off how long you have before that actually you trip over that line.
Sure.
And then once you have it, it can help your medications work better, potentially reduce medication or make them more effective. And just, again, even if it doesn't make you take less medicine for your blood sugar specifically, it's going to help with your overall health. Right. So,
well, this has been great. I know I've learned a lot. I've been reminded of a lot, and I definitely feel better about things. So, thank
Lord
you for.
knows I don't mind reminding you of things.
No, you don't. No, you don't. If you can't count on your wife to do something, that's what you can do it. So, Jane, thank you for joining us. You will be back, I have no doubt, and I appreciate you being here. And I've got 1,000 more things for us to talk about now, but this episode probably doesn't need to be 16 hours long. So I will save some of those, and we'll do some more in a bit. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you for coming. Well, that's our show for today. I'm going to invite you all to please like and subscribe so you'll hear all our future episodes. We're available anywhere you get your podcasts. Also, share this with your friends. Help them learn a little bit more about something going on in your life, something that matters to you, and maybe they'll learn to be a little better friends for you. The Rotten Hobby podcast is a production of Founder Development and is hosted by me, Jeremy Scott. Our guest this week was Dane Scott. This show is recorded and produced by me. Our theme music is by RKVC. This episode is copyright 2022. All rights are reserved.